I work at a historic hotel in New England, the kind with polished wood floors and portraits that seem to watch you breathe. Tonight, the ballroom was rented for a private family anniversary, a contained celebration designed to feel orderly and predictable. I was assigned to the perimeter refilling glasses and clearing plates, practicing the quiet skill of becoming invisible. The piano was not scheduled, which was the first thing that felt wrong. A guest had requested it earlier, and management declined, yet when the pianist began to play anyway, the sound moved through the room like a held breath finally released. Conversations thinned, chairs stopped scraping, and even the servers slowed their steps. That was when I noticed the boy. He was small for his age, perhaps 9 or 10, with metal supports hidden beneath his trousers, and a careful stillness that drew the eye. He sat straight hands folded, gaze fixed on the open space near the piano. Then, with deliberate patience, he stood. The motion looked negotiated, as if he were bargaining with his own body. His chair slid back a few inches, and no one reached for him. He did not speak. He simply looked at me and lifted his hand. Before I could move, the event coordinator appeared at my side, her voice low and urgent. "Please do not encourage this. It is not part of the program." Her eyes flicked toward the head table, already calculating consequences. At the nearest table, a woman leaned down toward the boy and smiled tightly. "Sweetheart, sit down. Do not make a scene." The room fell into a silence so complete it felt intentional. Every face turned toward the small space between the piano and the tables, and I became aware of my own heartbeat, loud and inconvenient. At the far end of the room, near a tall window framed by heavy curtains, stood his father. I recognized him from quiet photos rather than headlines, a single father with immense means. He rested one hand on the back of a chair and watched his son without expression. He did not step forward, and he did not look away. I crossed the floor and knelt until I was level with the boy. His hand remained raised steady despite the effort it cost him to stand. I kept my voice soft, meant only for him. "You do not have to be brave for me. Just be brave for one step." The pianist kept playing softer now, as if the room itself were listening, and I felt the weight of every rule pressing in, certain that once this moment moved, none of us would return unchanged, least of all the man. I stepped forward with him, but did not take his hand. I placed myself beside him close enough to be felt far enough to leave the choice his. He set the pace. The piano softened the notes, thinning until they sounded like questions instead of instructions. The metal at his ankle brushed the floor, a light scrape that cut through the room. One step, just one. His breath caught and then steadied. I matched him without guiding, letting my shoulder stay parallel to his as the space between us carried the work. From the corner of my eye, I saw his father lean forward by a fraction, the kind of movement that reveals instinct before discipline reins it back. Then he stopped himself. He stayed where he was. The room held its breath again. We did not continue. The step was enough. When the boy settled his weight and looked up at me, pride flashed across his face like a small sun breaking through cloud. Applause did not come. That mattered. What came instead was a low murmur, uncertain, searching for permission. Before the sound could gather, a hand closed around my elbow. The manager drew me aside with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Your shift ends now," he said quietly. "We will talk about your employment tomorrow." His voice was careful, practiced, designed to be final without being loud. I nodded. I had learned long ago that arguing in rooms like this only sharpens the blade. As I stepped back, I glanced once more toward the open floor. The boy had returned to his chair, hands folded again, posture taller than before. I let my eyes travel to the window. His father was still there, still watching. Our gazes met for a brief second that felt longer than it was. He did not gesture. He did not speak. He simply held the look as if committing the moment to memory. I felt the consequences settle in my body, the familiar weight of a job slipping away, the uncertainty that follows close behind. Yet beneath it ran something steadier, a quiet certainty that the step I had witnessed could not be undone by policy or protocol. As I gathered my things and moved toward the exit, the piano faded into silence. The room exhaled. The man by the window remained where he was. He had seen everything. He chose to say nothing. And that silence, I understood, was only the beginning. I have replayed that night many times, not because I think it made me brave, but because it revealed something I had learned long before and nearly forgotten. I am not wealthy. I am not idealistic in the way people mean when they accuse you of not understanding how the world works. I grew up counting hours instead of opportunities. I work service jobs because I have student loans that never quite shrink and because my younger brother lives with an illness that turns stability into a fragile, temporary thing. Life taught me early that dignity is not something handed out generously. It is something you protect quietly. Years ago, before schedules and uniforms and careful smiles, I studied human development with a focus on autonomy. I was drawn to the idea that people grow strongest when they are trusted to lead themselves even imperfectly. But theory does not pay rent. Reality rerouted me into work where the rules are clear and the expectations small. Smile. Do not disrupt. Do not take up space. When the manager took me aside that night, I felt the familiar tug of fear, the calculation of bills and groceries and obligations waiting at home. Walking away would have been easy in the sense that survival often demands obedience. What stopped me was not defiance, but memory. I remembered my brother learning to stand again after months in bed, how every well-meaning hand reaching for him made his shoulders tense. I remembered how he finally took a step only after everyone stepped back. Watching the boy by the piano, I saw that same tight focus, the same hunger to try without being corrected in advance. If I had stayed still, if I had pretended not to see him, he would have learned a lesson far heavier than the risk I took. He would have learned that the world rewards silence over effort. I did not think of myself as kind in that moment. Kindness suggests intention. I acted out of alignment, the refusal to let protocol define what was human. As I left the ballroom, the consequences pressed in practical and immediate. I would lose the job. That was likely. I would be talked about in careful tones. That was certain. Yet beneath the anxiety ran a steady conviction that surprised me. The boy had been allowed to choose. Nothing could take that away. That is what made walking away impossible. It was not about heroism or sacrifice. It was about consistency with the person I believed myself to be when no one was watching. I knew too well how rare it is for someone to step back instead of stepping in. We praise help without noticing how often it smothers. We confuse protection with control and call it love. The boy did not need a guide. He needed a witness. As I rode the bus home that night, the city sliding past in streaks of light, I felt the fear settle into resolve. Whatever came next would be earned honestly. I would not apologize for leaving space where others wanted order. If the world punished that choice, so be it. There are moments when refusing to walk away is the only way to remain intact, and I understood then that I would choose that integrity again, even knowing the cost. I thought about the man by the window more than I expected to. Not in the way people think about power, but in the way you notice a presence that alters the air in a room. He had not rushed forward or shut the moment down. He had not rescued his son from discomfort or embarrassment. He had watched. That restraint stayed with me. Over the next day, as I moved through errands and quiet obligations, I kept returning to the stillness of his posture, the careful distance he maintained from the scene he could have controlled with a word. From where I knelt, I had seen the tension in his shoulders, the way instinct leaned him forward and discipline pulled him back. It told me more than anger ever could. He was a man practiced in command, accustomed to shaping outcomes, yet bound by a private fear that made him hesitate. I imagined the calculus running behind his eyes, the years of decisions measured for risk and reward, and the way love scrambles that math. He did not look cruel. He looked careful to the point of rigidity, the kind of care that wraps itself around a child until nothing can move without permission. I recognized it because I had seen it before in parents who equate safety with stillness, who mistake silence for success. Later, when his name surfaced quietly through the channels that carry influence, it confirmed what his bearing suggested. He ran companies' boards and schedules with precision. He did not improvise. He planned. Yet that night, faced with his son's raised hand, planning failed him. Watching did not. I understood then that he had seen more than a step. He had seen a version of his child that existed beyond his management. That realization can frighten a parent who has built a world around control. It can also open a door. I wondered which way he would turn. In my experience, men like him are not unfeeling. They are overwhelmed by responsibility and convinced that vigilance is love. They learn to read rooms, to anticipate failure, to prevent it at all costs. What they struggle with is allowing uncertainty to breathe. The boy had created uncertainty simply by standing. The father had allowed it by staying still. That choice mattered. It told me he was not blind to the cost of his caution. It also told me he did not yet know how to step aside without losing himself. As the day wore on, I realized that the silence he chose after the step was not indifference. It was containment. He was holding something back, something he did not trust himself to release in public. That kind of restraint often precedes change if it is met with patience rather than pressure. I did not know then whether I would ever see him again. I only knew that he had seen everything, not just the movement on the floor, but the way space can be offered instead of imposed. For a man used to directing outcomes, witnessing that truth can be destabilizing. It can also be the beginning of learning to follow. 2 days later, an email arrived that did not look like an apology and did not read like a threat. It was precise, carefully worded, and sent from an address that belonged to a family office rather than a personal account. The subject line referenced the date of the event and a request for a brief meeting. I read it twice before replying, aware of how easily silence can be interpreted as defiance. The meeting was scheduled for mid-morning at an office tower I recognized only from the outside, a place designed to look unremarkable from the street. When I arrived, security checked my identification without comment and directed me to a waiting area that felt neutral by design. Nothing luxurious, nothing intimidating. That in itself felt deliberate. An assistant greeted me by name and offered water. A few minutes later, an HR advisor joined us, introduced plainly, and took a seat at the table. The father entered last. He did not waste time. He acknowledged the disruption to my employment and said he regretted the way the evening had concluded. The apology was measured, careful not to assume harm while still naming it. I appreciated that. He explained that the meeting was requested to clarify boundaries and to ensure there were no misunderstandings about intent. He spoke as someone accustomed to resolving issues before they become liabilities. The HR advisor listened pen-poised, ready to document. Then he shifted. He spoke about his son not in the language of diagnosis or accommodation, but in the language of scheduling and oversight. He described therapists' programs, assessments, and the constant effort to protect a child from disappointment. I recognized the pattern immediately. When he finished, he offered a proposal. It was framed as a role, not a favor. A support position with a generous salary, flexible hours, and clear parameters. The purpose, he said, was to provide continuity for his son, someone who could be present without adding pressure. He did not use the word hire, but the meaning was unmistakable. The assistant slid a folder across the table. Inside were details that answered practical questions before I could ask them. I felt the weight of the offer settle in the room. This was how solutions were built here. Thorough, insulated, compliant with policy. The HR advisor watched my face with professional neutrality. The father waited, hands folded, expression unreadable. I understood what was being offered beyond compensation. Stability. Relief. A way to smooth over an incident that had unsettled him. I also understood what it would cost. Accepting would mean stepping into a structure designed to manage outcomes, not to risk them. It would place me inside a system that believed care could be contracted. I took a breath and asked a question that surprised us all. I asked what would happen if his son chose not to engage. The room paused. The father answered honestly. He said they would encourage participation. He said encouragement had always worked before. That was when the truth of the invitation became clear. This was not about space. It was about continuity of control under a gentler name. I thanked him for the apology and for the clarity of the proposal. I acknowledged the professionalism of the process and the presence of safeguards. Then I asked for a moment. Silence filled the room again, smaller than the ballroom but just as heavy. I looked at the folder without touching it. I thought of the boy's raised hand, the step taken without instruction, the pride that followed. I understood that accepting would be easier. It would also undo the very thing that had mattered most. When I spoke, my voice was steady. I said I could not accept a role that replaced choice with oversight, even when offered with good intentions. The HR advisor glanced up. The assistant stilled. The father did not interrupt. For the first time since I entered, he looked uncertain. The invitation had been formal, anchored in process and protection. My refusal would be the same, clear, respectful, and grounded in reality. I was not rejecting him. I was rejecting the assumption that care must always come with control. I did not raise my voice when I refused. I did not soften it either. I spoke the way I had learned to speak when the stakes mattered, slowly and without ornament, choosing words that could stand on their own without apology. I said that his son did not need another person deciding what was best for him. I said he needed room. The sentence hung between us, simple and unyielding. I watched the father process it in real time, the way his brow tightened as if searching for a counter-argument he could present without sounding cruel. He did not find one quickly. He had expected resistance framed as negotiation, something he could adjust with terms or timing. What he received instead was a boundary. I explained that the step his son took was not remarkable because of distance or technique, but because it belonged to him. No one had corrected it. No one had rushed to make it safer. And in that brief freedom, something important had emerged. If I accepted the role, I would be paid to prevent that uncertainty from happening again. I could see the implications land. He leaned back, then forward, hands clasping and unclasping as if the movement might unlock a response. The HR advisor cleared her throat gently, reminding us both that the conversation needed to remain within scope. I nodded. I was within scope. I was naming the cost of control. I told him I understood fear. I told him I understood the instinct to shield a child from the world by building walls around them. I also told him that walls grow higher every time they work, and soon the person inside cannot see over them at all. The assistant watched silently, eyes moving between us. I felt my pulse in my ears, not from anger, but from the weight of being precise. This was the moment where people often soften their stance to avoid discomfort. I did not. I said I would not take a position that required me to stand between a child and his own choices. I said that love expressed as vigilance eventually teaches helplessness, even when it begins with devotion. The father looked at me, then really looked, not as an employee or a liability, but as someone who had witnessed his son without instruction. For a brief second, his composure faltered. He asked what I would suggest instead. The question surprised him as much as it surprised me. I took it seriously. I said I would suggest nothing unless invited. I said support that waits is different from support that directs. I said he could practice standing close without stepping in, letting silence do some of the work he had been doing alone. The HR advisor shifted in her seat pin, hovering. The assistant glanced at the folder still unopened. The father exhaled a controlled release that sounded like frustration restrained by pride. He said he had built his life on intervention, on seeing problems early and removing them before they grew. He said he did not know how to step back without abandoning responsibility. I told him stepping back was not the same as stepping away. The distinction seemed to land. He asked if my refusal was final. I said yes. I said I would not accept money to replace trust even when offered respectfully. I acknowledged the generosity of the offer and the care behind it. I also named the truth that accepting would turn a moment of autonomy into a managed outcome. Silence returned heavier, now filled with things unsaid. The HR advisor closed her notebook. The assistant straightened the folder without sliding it back. The father looked down at the table, then up at me, his expression unfamiliar, stripped of certainty. For the first time, he did not have an immediate answer. I recognized that pause for what it was: not defeat, but exposure. He was facing the possibility that love might require restraint he had never practiced. When the meeting ended, it did so without resolution. There was no agreement, no softened exit, no reassurance offered in place of acceptance. I stood, thanked them for their time, and walked out with my refusal intact. As I stepped back into the street, the city felt louder, less contained. I felt the risk settle fully, then the knowledge that I had closed a door that would not easily reopen. Beneath the fear was something steadier, a quiet pride that had nothing to do with victory. I had spoken without diminishing him and without diminishing myself. I had refused without contempt. I had chosen to protect a child's space rather than my own security. That choice did not feel heroic. It felt necessary. And somewhere behind the glass and the careful processes, a man who had seen everything was learning that not every problem could be solved by stepping in. The shift did not come as confrontation, but as erosion, the quiet kind that happens when a story begins to move without your consent. It started with a message from a former colleague who worked events across the city, asking if I was the woman from the anniversary dinner, the one who had stepped into the spotlight. I told her there was no spotlight, only a step, but the explanation felt thin even as I typed it. Within days, the whispers found shape. People said the moment had been staged, that no child simply stands unless prompted, that kindness like that always has a motive. Someone suggested I had identified a wealthy family and engineered access. Someone else said I was angling for a settlement after losing my job. None of it came directly to me at first. That was how I knew it mattered. Rumors gain weight when they travel through polite channels. A week later, a formal letter arrived from the family office requesting a follow-up conversation. The tone was different now, firmer, framed by concern for reputational risk. When I arrived, the assistant was there, but so was another woman I had not met before, introduced as a trustee and relative. She did not waste time. She said the family valued discretion and that recent attention made them uneasy. She said narratives tend to harden and that the safest course was to close the matter. She slid a document across the table. It was an NDA, comprehensive and generous in its compensation. The offer was positioned as protection for everyone involved. I read it slowly. It asked me to agree that the incident had been misinterpreted and that any future discussion would be limited. The money attached would have paid my loans, eased my brother's care, and bought a kind of peace I had never known. I looked up and asked a question I already knew the answer to. What would this mean for the boy? The trustee smiled, practiced and calm, and said, "Children forget moments like that quickly." The father had been quiet until then. He sat with his hands folded, listening, his jaw tight. I could feel him balancing competing truths, the instinct to shield his son from scrutiny, and the growing awareness that shielding often comes at a cost. I told them I would not sign. I said I would not exchange silence for security, especially when the silence required rewriting what had happened. The trustee's expression cooled. She said the family would proceed as needed. The meeting ended without ceremony. That afternoon, the rumor sharpened. A local blog published a vague piece about manufactured compassion in elite spaces. Comments multiplied. Some defended the family. Others questioned my character. I stayed quiet. Silence was not agreement. It was protection. The pressure moved inward then. The father reached out privately, asking to meet without advisors. I agreed, setting boundaries clearly. We spoke in a public place neutral and unremarkable. He told me he felt cornered. He told me his family believed containment was the only responsible option. He asked me to understand the weight he carried. I did. I also told him understanding did not require compliance. He asked what I wanted. The question startled him again. I said I wanted nothing except honesty about what mattered. I told him the rumor would pass if he stopped trying to manage it. I told him his son would remember the step whether the internet did or not. He grew quiet. Days later, the trustee called again, firmer this time, implying consequences. I felt the familiar pull toward retreat, the urge to protect myself by yielding. Instead, I wrote a brief statement and shared it with the event staff who had been there. It said only that the moment was unscripted and belonged to a child. I did not name the family. I did not defend myself. The response was immediate and divided. The pressure shifted to the father. He called me late that night. He said his advisors wanted him to release a statement distancing the family. He said he was tired of choosing safety over truth. He asked what choosing differently would cost. I said it would cost comfort and buy integrity. The next morning, he declined to pursue the NDA. He did not issue a defensive statement. He let the noise crest and fade on its own. The trustee was furious. The advisors were unsettled. The boy went to school as usual. In choosing not to manage the narrative, the father had made a second decision quieter than the first, but heavier. He had chosen his son's freedom over his own reputation. The rumor lost oxygen. The story loosened its grip. And in that uncomfortable space where control had been surrendered, something essential shifted not just for him, but for all of us who had been watching. The invitation did not come with fanfare. It arrived as a simple notice shared through a community calendar, an inclusion day hosted by a local art center that partnered with schools and families. The event was small by design, open to the public with clear permissions posted at the entrance about filming and photography. I attended because I had been asked to volunteer, nothing more, nothing less. When I arrived, folding chairs were arranged in uneven rows, children moved freely with parents nearby, and a few local videographers set up cameras with quiet efficiency. There was no stage, no lighting meant to impress, just a wide room with worn floors and open space. I noticed the boy when he entered with his father, not because he stood out, but because he moved with a concentration I recognized. He wore the same careful focus he had that night, only now it was paired with something new, a confidence that had settled into his posture. His father stayed close but did not hover. He greeted people politely, thanked volunteers, and positioned himself slightly behind his son rather than beside him. It was a small adjustment with large meaning. The program began without announcements. A facilitator invited anyone who wished to move to do so. Some children rolled forward, others stood still. The boy stepped into the open area on his own. I did not approach him. I stayed where I was, hands occupied, eyes present, but not directive. The room quieted naturally, not out of instruction but respect. Cameras rolled openly, not to capture a spectacle, but to document participation. The boy paused. There was no music. That absence felt intentional. He took a breath, shifted his weight, and then took a step. It was uneven and unmistakably his. He steadied himself and looked toward his father, not for permission, but to share the moment. The father remained still. His hands were relaxed at his sides. He did not reach. He did not speak. He allowed the silence to hold. A murmur rose, not applause, just recognition. Afterward, during a brief gathering meant to thank participants, someone asked the father if he would like to say a few words. He hesitated, then nodded. He stood where he was no podium, no notes. He spoke plainly. He said he had spent years believing love meant protection. He said he had confused preparation with control. He looked at his son and acknowledged that stepping back had been harder than stepping in. Then he said the sentence that shifted the room. I thought love meant protection. I was wrong. The words were not dramatic. They were careful, deliberate, and exposed. He did not apologize for the past in sweeping terms. He named the lesson and stopped there. The cameras captured it without zooming in. People did not rush him. The moment breathed. Afterward, children continued to move, some inspired, some indifferent as it should be. The boy returned to his father, who knelt to meet his eyes, not to correct but to listen. I watched from a distance, aware that this was not a performance, but a choice made in public, accountable, and irreversible. Later, when a reporter asked a question about lessons learned, the father redirected attention back to the children, saying they were the ones doing the work. He declined further comment. The restraint was notable. In allowing the moment to stand without amplification, he protected its integrity. As people filtered out, I felt the weight of the weeks before lift, slightly replaced by a quieter satisfaction. Redemption does not always announce itself. Sometimes it appears as a man choosing presence over control when it would be easier to retreat behind process. That day, in a room without polish or promise of acclaim, a choice was made that could not be bought or spun. It belonged to a father, a child, and the space between them that had finally been left open. I understood then that redemption is not a declaration. It is a practice visible when someone allows the truth to be seen without reaching to manage it. The cameras shut down. The chairs were stacked. Life continued. But something essential had shifted into place, steady and lasting, and it would shape what came next. What followed did not look like romance in the way stories usually sell it. There were no declarations, no dramatic shifts in proximity, no moments that demanded interpretation. What there was instead were conversations that took place after everyone else had gone home, when the floors were quiet and the work of the day had settled. He began to show up more often at the center, not announced, not surrounded by assistants. Sometimes he brought coffee for the volunteers. Sometimes he simply sat and watched. When we spoke, it was never about the night at the hotel or the rumors that followed. It was about small logistics and ordinary choices about schedules and what his son liked for breakfast, about how difficult it was to learn restraint when intervention had been rewarded his entire life. I listened without trying to fix anything. That mattered. He noticed. He told me once that most people spoke to him as if he were a solution rather than a person. With me, he said he felt allowed to think out loud. I told him that thinking out loud was different from acting out loud and that his son was teaching him the difference better than anyone else could. He did not disagree. Our interactions settled into a rhythm that felt earned rather than charged. We did not sit close. We did not touch. We stood side by side the way people do when they are learning to trust their own footing. He asked questions without expecting answers. I answered when it felt appropriate and stayed quiet when it did not. Over time, he grew more comfortable with silence, with letting conversations end without conclusions. That change was subtle but unmistakable. He began to notice things he had previously overlooked, the way his son relaxed when given time, the way progress looked different when it was not measured against a plan. One afternoon, as we watched the children finish a session, he said he was embarrassed by how much he had missed. I did not reassure him. I told him noticing was the work now. He nodded and accepted that without defense. When people asked what we were to each other, we gave answers that satisfied without defining. Friends, collaborators, parents in adjacent roles. The ambiguity protected something fragile and growing. If there was affection, it lived in respect. If there was attraction, it waited its turn. He never offered money. I never offered guidance beyond what was asked. The balance held because we honored it deliberately. On a cool evening after a long day, he walked with me to the bus stop. We stood without speaking as traffic passed. When he finally spoke, he said he was learning how to be present without performing usefulness. I told him that presence was not passive, that it required attention and humility. He smiled, not because he had mastered it, but because he understood the effort involved. That was the closest we came to intimacy, then shared recognition without claim. When we parted, there was no promise made. None was needed. What mattered was the pace. We were not moving towards something to be claimed. We were learning how to remain open without taking up space that did not belong to us. For people our age, love often arrives quieter than expected, built on observation and restraint. If this was the beginning of anything, it was a beginning rooted in patience, in the understanding that care deepens when it is allowed to grow without pressure. That restraint, I knew, was the most honest signal of affection either of us could offer. Change did not announce itself with banners or press releases. It arrived in routines, in the way mornings were planned and evenings were allowed to end without being optimized. The family adjusted their days quietly. Appointments were spaced with intention. Decisions were discussed rather than delivered. The father learned to ask questions and to wait for answers that did not come on demand. He stopped narrating progress and began noticing it. There were no speeches about transformation and no glossy updates meant to reassure donors or boards. In fact, he declined several invitations to attach his name to programs that would have amplified attention. When asked why he said the work did not need him to be visible to be effective, that answer surprised people who expected momentum to be measured by scale. What grew instead was consistency. His son chose when to participate and when to rest. Some days he moved boldly. Other days he sat and watched. Both were treated as success. The father practiced being nearby without hovering present without instruction. He learned that presence could be active without being intrusive, that love could be steady without being loud. I returned to my community work with renewed focus, not because I had been inspired by wealth, but because I had been reminded of what quiet support can accomplish. We crossed paths usually in practical settings that required no performance. At school meetings, he listened more than he spoke. At gatherings, he stood back and let his son lead introductions. When people noticed the change and asked what had shifted, he answered plainly that he had learned to follow. The simplicity disarmed them. There was no foundation announced, no naming rights accepted. Resources were directed where they were asked for and then left alone. The work expanded in small ways through relationships rather than branding. Volunteers stayed because they felt trusted. Families returned because they felt respected. The father watched this network grow without trying to shape it. That restraint became his legacy. It showed up in how his son approached challenges with less fear, in how decisions were framed as invitations rather than instructions. It showed up in the absence of spectacle, which allowed the work to belong to the people doing it. I noticed how the father carried himself differently, lighter somehow, as if releasing control had freed energy he had not known was bound. We spoke occasionally about the future, not in terms of plans, but in terms of principles. He said he wanted to be remembered by his son as someone who learned when to step back. I said that memory is built from repeated choices, not declarations. He agreed. Legacy, we discovered, is not created by standing at the center. It is created by choosing where not to stand. By the time months had passed, the noise from the rumors had faded completely, replaced by a quiet respect that did not require explanation. Life continued in ordinary ways. School days ended. Sessions concluded. People went home tired and satisfied. There was no single moment to point to and say this is when everything changed. That was the point. The change lasted because it was woven into daily practice rather than displayed. When I looked at the family from the edge of the room, I saw something durable taking shape, a way of being that did not depend on attention to survive. That more than any announcement felt like the truest measure of success. The image that stays with me is not dramatic. It does not ask to be replayed. It happens on an ordinary afternoon when the room is half empty and the light slants across the floor without ceremony. The boy stands at the edge of the space, his attention turned inward, measuring himself without an audience. His father is nearby, close enough to be felt, far enough to leave the decision untouched. There is no music this time, no cue to follow, just the quiet understanding that the choice belongs to the one who will make it. The boy shifts his weight, steadies his breath, and takes a step. It is small and unmistakably his. He pauses, adjusts, and takes another. The father does not move. His hands remain at his sides, relaxed, open. I feel the familiar pull to mark the moment, to say something that would fix it in place. I do not. The power of it lives in what is left unsaid. The boy looks up and smiles, not seeking approval, but sharing satisfaction. His father returns the smile without reaching. That restraint feels like love learned the hard way. I think about how many times we rush to help because we are uncomfortable with waiting, how often we mistake action for care. What I witnessed taught me something simpler and more demanding. Kindness is not about pushing someone forward. It is about stepping back so they can lead. The days that followed did not require celebration. They required consistency, and that is where the real work lived. As I walked away that afternoon, I understood that the most meaningful changes often happen quietly, away from the places that reward performance. They happen when someone chooses trust over control, presence over instruction. If this story has stayed with you, perhaps it is because you recognize the courage it takes to wait. Perhaps you have stood in rooms where stepping in felt easier than stepping back. Or perhaps you have been the one waiting for space to try. Wherever you find yourself, remember that small steps matter when they are chosen freely. Families change when patience replaces fear. Love deepens when it allows room. If you believe that moments like this can reshape lives without spectacle, you are not alone. Stay with us for stories that honor quiet courage, shared learning, and the strength found in letting others lead.